Good morning. This is lecture 3 for the Consecutive Techniques and Criminal Terminology course. Up to this point, we have been talking about a technique that deals with the domain, the different columns, and which is a two-dimension technique. From left to right, it denotes the domains and the owners of those domains, and then from top to bottom will provide the sequence of the original. We introduced in our last lecture a new app into this technique. As we discussed in the past, the whole point about this technique is to have a structure and then to have different apps that you introduced into that structure to be able to make it robust and be able to use it in a regular segment. So far, what we have seen is that if you look at everything that we have done so far, you may at this point question, well, this technique looks great, but I cannot apply it to every single segment. And that is absolutely true. Because as you recall from the very first day that we started this course, I told you that don't expect the consecutive, the original, to adapt to the technique that you know. The goal that you have is to be able to adapt to the consecutive, meaning that you have to use different techniques for different segments. So today we're going to continue working with the technique, of course, but then we're going to be enhancing all this from a practical point of view and look at what are the different options when it comes to a segment in a consecutive. There are, of course, specific requirements for you to use this technique. You wouldn't use this technique if there is only, if the segment is very short, for example. You will only use this technique when there are many participants, and particularly when there is a description, when there is something that is happening that requires that you take a lot of notes. So there is, like in anything else when it comes to interpreting, the experience in terms of consecutive particularly plays a very important role, because you have to somehow be able to predict which actual approach that you have learned. And an approach is basically the application of a technique. See, what we have learned is we have a technique. So let's say you have technique 1, 2, 3, 4. And then on this side, you have an approach. An approach is defined as the application of a technique that you already learned. A technique that you learned. You already learned. You already, learned. So, in our cases, you may say, well, where are the 4 techniques? Now, we have been spending most of our time developing one of them. We briefly touched the surface of this one, which is the one that has to do with symbols. You remember that? And we learn it just to incorporate it here as well. We still have 2 more, and these 2 more generally kind of covers all the different type of consecutive. Once you know these 2, then what happens is that now you can look at a consecutive and determine which of these 4 should apply, and in 95% of the cases, these 4 techniques, there's a 5th one, I think. These 5 techniques will help you in recalling the original. So the reason why we spend so much time on number 1 is because the technique number 1 is the most powerful of all, and it's usually the technique you must use in the most difficult segments in your state examination. Because as you recall, whenever there is any type of interaction between people, particularly when there are different type of active participants, it's excessively difficult, very difficult for you to be able to recall that if you don't have a technique. So we spend most of the time, and we are spending most of the time on number one, but today we're going to be learning all these other techniques so that you can, and then also learn as to what should be, how do you know which technique to use. So we're going to be learning all that today. And then next week, the idea is to apply it in a real consecutive so that we can basically look at this approach that we have and said, okay, now I feel confident that I can apply this technique. And therefore, you basically, once you can do that, then you basically have control of this technique, or rather this mode of interpretation. It should be pointed out, however, that it is very, very common for students to modify techniques. And by that I mean that it's very common that a technique number 1, 2, or 3, whatever technique it is, the student tends to modify it slightly. When it comes to the technique that we are using right now, which is technique number 1, I was very strict in a couple of things that we already talked about. And that was like you always had to have one word in a given column. If you draw a line like this, you remember that. I kept insisting on that. And the reason why I made that comment or that restriction is that because as you learn that when we open an app, then there are really two things that can happen on the same line. So that just to prevent any confusion and also to make sure that you can fully develop this technique. But there are some techniques that are not so structured that we're going to talk about today, where the student tends to make modifications to it. Is it okay? And the answer is absolutely. You can modify the technique. Nobody's going to be checking and grading your technique. They don't grade your technique at all. When you take your state examination, you will be asked to leave your notes with the examiner, not because they are going to grade your notes. They're actually going to throw it away. The reason why they ask for that is because if you leave the room with your notes, then you're leaving with the room with information on that particular exam, and they don't want that to be disseminated. So don't think that people or graders or anybody or even myself, when I if I were to give you a test on this, that I would be any concern of the technique about that you use. It's just completely irrelevant. We don't grade techniques. What we do grade is the final product, and that is the original message and your rendition, and that's what we do grade. But nobody grades your technique, so that means that you can have modifications to that technique. When it comes to symbols, for example, you can use different things. You can, for example, you may say this means to enter into a hospital, but it could also be this. I mean, whatever you want it to be. It doesn't really matter, and some people just use a lowercase h. There is no rule. There's no rule. The technique is there to aid your memory, your short-term memory, to recall the original. It's not, the technique is not there to, I mean, we're not, as interpreters, we're not concerned about how neat the technique is. We are concerned about how accurate the message was transferred, the original message was transferred. And that's what you should always keep in mind. It's just critical that you do not have any, that you have some creativity when it comes to developing your technique. As a matter of fact, as time goes by and you start using this technique, you will have a different approach or some modifications. The thing is that, as I told you at the beginning, is that you're really learning all these techniques for the state examination more than anything else, because in real life, we, as I told you, they will allow the interpreter to stop. Not only allow, they will make the interpreter stop the person testifying once the interpreter feels that it's just too long of a segment. So in real life, these techniques that we are developing here are rarely used because, as you probably noticed, this one is for very long segments. And in real life, if you don't stop the witness when it gets very, when it gets a very long segment, what you're going to see is that the judge will stop the witness. And if the judge stops the witness, then the judge may stop the witness in the middle of a thought. That creates a lot of problems because then the rendition of that segment is incomplete. And when you ask the person to continue, it's not going to be able to continue. So it is not advisable for you to let the judge stop the witness. You got to, you have to have it's part of your protocol, right? You stop the person when you feel that it is getting too long of a segment, and you always stop the person at the end of a sentence, at the end of a thought. Okay, that's very, very important. There are many ways that you stop that individual at the end of the thought. In fact, today we're going to watch a short video, more like thinking about court. See, this course is mainly about the state exam, but we also have to look at what happens in court. And there are many ways you can stop that person. You can, you can put your hand like this and say un momento, and then you interpret, continue. Or what most interpreters do, particularly nowadays that you do a lot of cases through video remote interpreting, where you can't really be controlling the witness that well with your hand, then what you will do, what the interpreter will do, is the interpreter will start speaking when the interpreter wants to interrupt the witness, and that will occur always at the end of a sentence. Sometimes the sentences are very short and there is no need for the interpreter to do that, but if the person is speaking and then the interpreter feels that this is just too long of a segment, then the interpreter starts interpreting as soon as that person ends a thought. And it is kind of telling the person quiet, right, in a nice way. So the interpreter renders, and then that's the end of the story. Now, there are always some controversy about this because there is kind of there are two different approaches here that contradict each other. See, the court wants to make sure that the record is accurate, and therefore the judge will always ask the interpreter, or the judge will do it himself or herself, stop the person when the judge considers that the segment is too long. Now, is that accurate? Yes, it's accurate as far as what the person has said, because you basically have to deal with a very short segment, and therefore the probability of the interpretation being accurate is very high. And that's one approach. But what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that the person wanted to express a thought, and you may have interrupted the person in the middle of that thought. Yes, it's a complete sentence, but the witness is not really expressing the whole thing that he or she wants to express. So when that person is interrupted in the middle of a thought, and remember now the interpreter has to say that in English, which will take a good 30 seconds or so, maybe up to 45 seconds, depending on the length of the segment. And then the interpreter tells you continue, the witness lost that process, right? So lost track of what he wanted to say. So is this accurate? Well, it's accurate in terms of what was said, but interrupting a witness is not accurate. Imagine this scenario. Imagine the witness spoke only or speaks only English. Do you think that the attorney or the judge will interrupt the witness in the middle of a thought? For what purpose? So when you look at this two different approaches, or to what the court thinks and what reality says, they don't necessarily, they collide. Because the judge wants to make sure that you render correctly what was said by the individual, by the witness, and therefore that's why this controlling of the length of the segment is important. But by the same token, in doing that, the judge prevents, or the interpreter, by stopping the witness, prevents the witness from actually expressing his full thought, which it doesn't happen when somebody speaks English. So whenever you find a situation in court where the English speaker is treated differently than the Spanish speaker, or the Spanish speaker is treated differently than the English speaker, then there is no equal access. And that's a big issue. In this case, equal access to the court refers specifically as to equal access, in this case, to your testimony, to what you want to say. So that's one issue. What's the other problem? So what would be the alternative? The alternative will be to let the person talk, the witness talk until the end, and then interpret this. But then here comes the problem with the court. The court thinks there's no way that an interpreter can remember a segment that it is 200-300 words, and the judge is accurate in saying that. It's correct, because it's very hard to remember 200-300 words. It's very difficult. So now if you do allow the witness to answer the whole question and express himself until the very end, just express his thought, fully express his thought. It could be such a long segment, particularly when you speak Spanish, that then there could be inaccuracies in the rendition, and therefore the record is not accurate, because what the person what the person wanted to say, she or he, the witness, said something, and the witness expects that to be transferring to English in its totality, but it isn't. And then some details are left out, and therefore the record now incorporates those inaccuracies, and it's not necessarily what the witness said. So you can see the dilemma here, the issue that occurs when you are interpreting in consecutive, particularly interpreting for a witness. And that's the biggest issue. Now, in the state exam, they try to take the second approach, meaning that they control the length of the segments, not you. And in most interpreting exams, depending on what it is, the length of the segment can be from 1 word up to, in the state exam, about 45. In the federal exam, up to 75. Still doesn't solve the issue, because in an exam situation, everything is kind of in a control environment. So when they create the questions, they, meaning the examiners, create the questions that are asked to the witness and the answers. They make sure that the witness answers that question within that maximum number of terms. In other words, they make sure that the witness express his or her thought within the maximum number of terms that you want the candidate to be tested on. In real life, that doesn't happen because there are no limits. People talk as much as they want. And this is really where we have controversy in terms of what happens in real life and what are the approaches that occur, whether to stop the person and not let that person necessarily express his full thought, or whether you allow the person to express his full thought, but then introduce some inaccuracies on the record. In both cases, you have issues. In the first one, the issue is that, yes, you may deliver very accurately what was said, but the thought, which is what you really want as an attorney when you ask a question to a witness, is not fully expressed. In the second one, the thought is fully expressed, but the accuracy of the rendition may introduce inaccuracies. I mean, maybe it's not going to be the greatest. Now, it's possible that the interpreter is very, very good. The interpreter will be able to deliver a very long segment without any inaccuracies. That will be the ideal scenario. But we know that that's very difficult. And the reason why it's difficult, it's not because it's not possible, but it has been shown that after a certain number of terms, rendition of testimony using consecutive technique is possible and it will be accurate, but it requires some degree of summarization. In other words, you're going to be more like summarizing, and there might be certain minor details that will be overlooked by the interpreter. And the problem is that in court, the rule is to interpret without summarization. So you can see all these conflicting requirements that the interpreter is subject to. Personally, in a consecutive, the best way to interpret the consecutive is through using technology, and that will solve the issue. And by that I mean the interpreter can have a little recording like that, record what is being said at the same time that is being said. And then after that, the interpreter will automatically play that, and now the interpreter is hearing and interpreting at the same time. Therefore, the accuracy is better, and the duration of the segment, how long the segment is or was, is basically irrelevant, because now it becomes a simultaneous interpretation, which of course it will completely it will completely eliminate the consecutive mode. And that's the only way that you can really do this correctly. And that the other important thing is that the interpreter should not be next to the witness. The ideal scenario will be that the witness is in one place, the interpreter is in another place. The witness has headsets, and therefore hears only the interpreter. It has a mic, and then the interpreter, who is maybe a little bit further, like maybe a few feet away from the witness, has those special mics that are covered like that. And as the interpreter hears the original, the interpreter is actually repeating. There are two ways. The interpreter can actually say it in simultaneous, or it can repeat it in the same language. And then if the interpreter repeats that in the same language, then the interpreter will then play it back, and it has to be really automatic. The machine has to be suitable for this, right? And the interpreter plays it back. They hear in Spanish, so the interpreter transfers that for the record in English, but in this case using the simultaneous mode. Or the interpreter interprets at the same time what he or she hears in simultaneous into English, and then just basically plays that for the record so that everybody can hear. That will solve the issue. That will solve the problem in terms of it will be a fair way, because that way there is no interruption of the witness, as it is not in the case of an English-speaking witness. And then there is definitely no potential inaccuracies introduced on the record. So again, everything that we are learning here are just for the state exam, and when you go to real life, you basically are called to control the length of the original segment. For example, if you work in immigration court, when you get evaluated every year, one of the items that they evaluate you on is whether or not you control the length of the original segment. If you allow the segment to be very long, maybe let's say 30, 40 words, and you still deliver it correctly, they will point out that you should have not done that you should have controlled the length of the original segment, because there is always the potential for inaccuracies when the segment exceeds a certain number of words, usually 20, 23. So that's one of the observations that I have in regards to the consecutive. So it's a technique that is widely used for testimony, but you can see that it has a lot of flaws in many different ways. And not only the technique itself has flaws. I wouldn't say the technique has flaws. I'll take that back. I would, however, say is that the application of the technique has flaws. Either stopping the person so that you're accurate in terms of what the person just said, or allowing the person to express his or her thought, and then perhaps being inaccurate in the rendition. And that's the way it is. For us, for this class, we're trying to get both sides of this. In other words, we're trying to train you for very long segments, as we have been doing. And then also you have to deal with shorter segments. It's clearly much easier to control the length of the segment. And that will be in real life. But in the state exam, there is a limitation. You can't really control length of the segments. In the state exam, the segments are going to be up to 45 terms, and then, that's what it's going to be. Usually you won't exceed it. But again, as I told you earlier, it's a control environment. The examiners control it. But in real life, there is no control environment, because it's whatever the witness wants to testify. This what I just discussed is important for you to understand the limitations of the technique and the uncertainty about the application of this technique. Some courts, so now comes the following question or dilemma. Some judges want the witness to express his whole thought, and therefore will not allow the interpreter to stop. Other judges will force the interpreter to stop the witness. In general, in court interpreting, the 95% will ask you to stop the witness. So that's the approach you take. But there might be a judge that after you do that a couple of times, the judge may say, Madam Interpreter or Mr. Interpreter, please let the witness finish his thought. In which case you have to be prepared for that, which that there could very well be inaccuracies in the rendition, because the length of the segment is just simply too long. You could develop a skill. See, if all you do is interpret using the consecutive mode in your job 6-7 hours a day, which God forbid you have to do that, it's very possible that you develop that skill to such a degree that you can deliver very long segments. In fact, there are some courts where there are some specific interpreters that are used specifically for witness testimony. And that's done because the rationale behind that is that the more you practice with this, the more you do this, then the better you're going to get at it. But there is a flaw in that thinking process as well, because you could have already very bad habits, and those bad habits will not be raised by doing more practice. In fact, they will be reinforced. And each time you go and do an interpretation, you still you use the same bad habits. So it's a touchy, difficult thing and it is so important if you think about it. Of everything we do in court, the most important thing is interpreting testimony, because testimony that it is given is rendered in Spanish has to be transferred into English, and whatever you say in English is what goes on the record, not what was said in Spanish. And therefore, if there is an appeal, it's going to go only by the record, meaning the version of the interpreter. So if the interpreter introduced inaccuracies, or the interpreter omitted, minor details, or even major details, the record will so indicate, and the whole appeal process and the decision of the appellate judge will be based on that. In fact, not only the appeals process, the question that was asked in English by an attorney and the thinking process of that attorney will vary depending on the answer. So if the answer includes some type of an introduction of some type of inaccuracy, then the attorney thinks that that's indeed what the witness said, but in fact the witness didn't say that. It's the interpreter who added it. So you can see the importance of it. That's why in civil cases where there are millions of dollars at stake, when there is an interpreter doing that, interpreting in a consecutive mode, there's usually a second interpreter hired by the other party, checking on the interpretation given by the interpreter. It's not uncommon, and I have been on both sides of the equation, being checked and then as well as checking. And of course, the interpreter who is checking the other interpreter will not interrupt the proceeding, but will take note of the inaccuracy, give that information to the attorney, and then the attorney will ask questions accordingly to clarify those inaccuracies. The ideal scenario will be, and this is something that you will see in court a lot, the attorneys will always tell the witnesses, make sure you answer in a short answer, okay? And another way of saying is that if you can answer with a yes or no, answer with a yes or no, sir. But there is a cross-cultural difference here that we should be aware of. And that cross-cultural difference is that in Latin America, in the US, if you can answer with a yes or no and you do so, then it's an indication that you're telling the truth. Why explain? See, explaining in the US has a tendency of trying to hide something. Why are you explaining so much? In Latin America, it's exactly the opposite. If you answer with a yes or no and you're not explaining, you're hiding. So there is a cross-cultural difference, and it's not only in Latin America, in many other countries, this is the same case, the same thing. So keeping all that in mind, we developed this technique just to give you the ability to perhaps deal with longer segments. But again, the segments that are very long have to have a certain condition for you to use this technique, and that is that there are participants interacting with each other. If it's only about one person talking, this can help you, but not as much as if participants are interacting with each other. So there are always issues when it comes to the consecutive mode of interpretation. All we can do is get you ready for your state examination.